biggest mistakes of the evolution of the internet, that in a way the default was to let our data be plundered. It's hard to undo that, but I think we can at least create a new regime that in future makes privacy default rather than open access default. I am glad I was not around in the mid-14th century when the bubonic plague swept across Eurasia. As far as we can see, that was history's worst pandemic. Maybe there was a comparably bad one in the reign of the Emperor Justinian, but there's some reason to think it wasn't as bad. And the more we learn about the 14th century, the more we realize that it really was across Eurasia, and the mortality was 30%, in some places 50%, in some places higher. There were whole towns that were just emptied. And when one reads about the Black Death, it's an unimaginable nightmare of death and madness in the death, with flagellant orders wandering from town to town, seeking to ward off divine retribution by flogging themselves, people turning on the local Jewish communities as if it's somehow their fault. That must have been a nightmarish time. If you ask me for an also ran and runner-up, it would be World War II in Eastern Europe. And in many ways, it might have been worse, because for a medieval peasant, the sense of being on the wrong side of divine retribution must have been overpowering. In the mid-20th century, you knew that this was man-made murder on a massive industrial scale. If one reads Grossman's Life and Fate, just to take one example, one enters a hellscape that it's extremely hard to imagine oneself in. So these are two of the great disasters of human history. And if we did have a time machine, if one really were able to transport people back and give them a glimpse of these times, I think the post-traumatic stress would be enormous. People would come back from those trips, even if it was a one-day excursion with guaranteed survival, in a state of utter shock. The great turning point in world history is August the 2nd, 1914, when the British cabinet decides to intervene, and what would have been a European war becomes a world war. And with British intervention, it becomes a massively larger and more protracted conflict. So very early in my career, I became very preoccupied with the deliberations on that day, and the surprising decision that a Liberal cabinet took to go to war, which you might not have bet on that morning, because there seemed to be a majority of cabinet members who would be disinclined, and only a minority, including Winston Churchill, who wanted to go to war. So that's one turning point. I often wish I could get my time machine working and go back and say, wait, stop. Just think about what you're going to do. And by the way, let me show you a video of Europe in 1918. So that's one. This argument was central to my book, The Pity of War. I also did an essay in Virtual History about this. And it's always amused me that from around that time, I began to be called a conservative historian, because it's actually a very left-wing argument. The people in 1914 who thought Britain should stay at the war were the left of the Labour Party, who split to become the Independent Labour Party. What would have happened? Well, first of all, Britain was not ready for war in 1914. There had not been conscription. The army was tiny. So Britain had failed to deter Germany. The Germans took the decision that they could risk going through Belgium, using the Schlieffen Plan to fight their two-front war. They calculated that Britain's intervention would either not happen or not matter. If Britain had been strategically committed to preventing Germany winning a war in Europe, they should have introduced conscription 10 years before, had a meaningful land army, and that would have deterred the Germans. So the Liberal government provided the worst of both worlds, a commitment that was more or less secret to intervene, that the public didn't know about, in fact, much of the Liberal Party didn't know about, but without really the means to make that intervention effective, a tiny army with just a few divisions. So it was perfectly reasonable to argue, as a number of people did on August the 2nd, 1914, that Britain should not intervene. After all, Britain had not immediately intervened against the French revolutionary armies back in the 1790s. It had played an offshore role, ultimately intervening, but not immediately intervening. If Britain had stayed out, I don't think that France would have collapsed immediately as it had in 1870. The French held up remarkably well to catastrophic casualties in the first 6 months of the First World War. But by 1916, I don't see how France could have kept going if Britain had not joined the war. And I think the war would have been over perhaps at some point in 1916. We know that Germany's aims would have been significantly limited because they would have needed to keep Britain out. If they'd succeeded in keeping Britain out, they'd have had to keep Britain out. And the way to keep Britain out was obviously not to make any annexation of Belgium, to limit German war aims, particularly to limit them to Eastern Europe. And from Britain's point of view, what was not to like? So the Russian Empire is defeated along with France. What does that really change? If the Germans are sensible, and we can see what this might have looked like, they focus on Eastern Europe. They take chunks of the Russian Empire. Perhaps they create, as they did in the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, an independent or quasi-independent Poland. In no way does that pose a threat to the British Empire. In fact, it's a good thing. Britain never had a particularly good relationship with the Russian Empire after all. The key point here is that the Germany that emerges from victory in 1916 has a kind of European Union. It's the dominant power of an enlarged Germany with a significant Mitteleuropa, whatever you want to call it, customs union type arrangement with neighboring countries, including, one suspects, Austria-Hungary. That is a very different world from the world of 1917-18. The protraction of the war for a further 2 years, its globalization, which Britain's intervention made inevitable. As Philip Zelikow showed in his recent book on the failure to make peace in 1916, Woodrow Wilson tried and failed to intervene and broker a peace in 1916. So I'm not the only counterfactualist here. The extension of the war for a further 2 years with escalating slaughter, the death toll rose because the industrial capacity of the armies grew greater. That's what condemns us to the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's what condemns us ultimately to Nazism, because it's out of the experience of defeat in 1918, as Hitler makes clear in Mein Kampf, that he becomes radicalized and enters the political realm. Take out those additional years of war and Hitler's just a failed artist. It's the end of the war that turns him into the demagogue. You asked what are the things that avoid the totalitarian states. As I've said, British non-intervention for me is the most plausible, and it takes out all of that malignant history that follows from the Bolshevik Revolution. It's very hard for me to see how Lenin gets anywhere if the war is over. That looks like the opportunity for the constitutional elements, the liberal elements in Russia. There are other moments at which you can imagine history taking a different path. If the provisional government in Russia had been more ruthless, it was very lenient towards the Bolsheviks, but if it had just rounded them up and shot the Bolshevik leadership, that would have certainly cut the Bolshevik Revolution off. One looks back on the conduct of the Russian liberals with the kind of despair at their failure to see the scale of the threat that they faced and the ruthlessness that the Bolshevik leadership would evince. There's a counterfactual in Germany, which is interesting. I think the Weimar Republic destroyed itself in two disastrous economic calamities, the inflation and then the deflation. It's difficult for me to imagine Hitler getting to be Reich Chancellor without those huge economic disasters. So another part of my early work explored alternative policy options that the German Republic, the Weimar Republic, might have pursued. There are other contingencies that spring to mind. In 1936 or 38, I think more plausibly 38, Britain should have gone to war. The great mistake was Munich. Hitler was in an extremely vulnerable position in 1938 because remember, he didn't have Russia squared away as he would in 1939. Chamberlain's mistake was to fold instead of going for war, as Churchill rightly saw, and there was a magical opportunity there that would have played into the hands of the German military opposition and conservatives to snuff Hitler out over Czechoslovakia. I could go on. The point is that history is not some inexorable narrative which can only end one way. It's a garden of forking paths. And at many, many junctions in the road, there were choices that could have averted the calamities of the mid-20th century. Well, Hitler was bluffing. He really wasn't ready for war in 1938. The German economy was clearly not ready for war in 1938. And Chamberlain made a fundamental miscalculation, along with his advisors, because it wasn't all Chamberlain. He was, in many ways, articulating the establishment view. And I tried to show in a book called War of the World how that establishment worked. It extended through the BBC into the aristocracy, to Oxford. There was an establishment view. Chamberlain personified it. Churchill was seen as a warmonger. He was at his lowest point of popularity in 1938. But what is it that Chamberlain gets wrong? Because it's conceptual. Chamberlain is persuaded that Britain has to play for time because Britain is not ready for war in 1938. He fails to see that the time that he gets, that he buys at Munich, is also available to Hitler. Everybody gets the time, and Hitler's able to do much more with it because Hitler strikes the pact with Stalin that guarantees that Germany can fight a war on one front in 1939. What does Chamberlain do? Builds some more aircraft. So the great mistake of the strategy of appeasement was to play for time. I mean, they knew war was coming, but they were playing for time, not realizing that Hitler got the time too. And after he partitioned Czechoslovakia, he was in a much stronger position, not least because of all the resources that they were able to plunder from Czechoslovakia. So that was the conceptual mistake. Churchill played an heroic role in pointing out this mistake and predicting accurately that it would lead to war on worse terms. What does it take? It takes a distinct courage to be unpopular. And Churchill was deeply unpopular at that point. People would listen to him in the House of Commons in silence. On one occasion, Lady Astor shouted, "Rubbish!" So he went through a period of being hated on. Yeah. The other thing that made Churchill a formidable leader was that he always applied history to the problem. And that's why he gets it right. He sees the historical problem much more clearly than Chamberlain. So I think if you go back to 1938, there's no realistic counterfactual in which Churchill's in government in 1938. You have to have France collapse for Churchill to come into government. But you can certainly imagine a Tory elite that's thinking more clearly about the likely dynamics. They haven't seen this, I guess, problem of conjecture, to take a phrase from Kissinger, which is that whatever they're doing in postponing the war has the potential to create a worse starting point for the war. It would have been risky in 1938, but it was a way better situation than they ended up with in 1939, a year later. You asked about Kissinger, and I've learned a lot from reading Kissinger and talking to Kissinger since I embarked on writing his biography a great many years ago. I think one of the most important things I've learned is that you can apply history to contemporary problems. It may be the most important tool that we have in that kind of decision-making. You have to do it quite ruthlessly and rigorously. And in the moment of crisis, you have to take risk. So, Kissinger often says in his early work, the temptation of the bureaucrat is to wait for more data. But ultimately, the decision-making that we do under uncertainty can't be based on data. The problem of conjecture is that you could take an action now and incur some cost and avert disaster, but you'll get no thanks for it because nobody is grateful for an averted disaster. Mm-hmm. And nobody goes around saying, wasn't it wonderful how we didn't have another 9/11? On the other hand, you can do nothing, incur no upfront costs, and hope for the best. And you might get lucky, the disaster might not happen. That's, in a democratic system, the much easier path to take. And I think the essence of leadership is to be ready to take that upfront cost, avert the disaster, and accept that you won't get gratitude. Doom was a book that I was planning to write before the pandemic struck, as a history of the future based in large measure on science fiction. It had occurred to me in 2019 that I had spent too long not reading science fiction, and so I decided I would liven up my intake by getting off history for a bit and reading science fiction. Because history is great at telling you about the perennial problems of power. Putin is always interesting on history. He's become something of a historian recently with his essays and lectures. But what history is bad at telling you is, well, what will the effects of discontinuity of technology be? And so I thought I need some science fiction to think more about this, because I'm tending to miss the importance of technological discontinuity. If you read a lot of science fiction, you read a lot of plague books, because science fiction writers are really quite fond of the plague scenario. So the world ends in many ways in science fiction, but one of the most popular is the lethal pandemic. So when the first email came to me, I think it was on January the 3rd from my medical friend Justin Stebbing, funny pneumonia in Wuhan, my antennae began to tingle, because it was just like one of those science fiction books that begins in just that way. In a pandemic, as Larry Brilliant, the epidemiologist, said many years ago, the key is early detection and early action. That's how you deal with a novel pathogen. And almost no Western country did that. We know it was doable because the Taiwanese and the South Koreans did it, and they did it very well. But really no Western country got this right. Some were unlucky because super spreader events happened earlier than in other countries. Italy was hit very hard very early. For other countries, the real disaster came quite late. Russia, which has only relatively recently had a really bad experience. The lesson for me is quite different from the one that most journalists thought they were learning last year. Most journalists last year thought, Trump is a terrible president. He's saying a lot of crazy things. It's his fault that we have high excess mortality in the United States. The same argument was being made by journalists in Britain, Boris Johnson, ... Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, ... even India, Narendra Modi. The same argument. And I think this argument is wrong in a few ways. It's true that the populist leaders said many crazy things and, broadly speaking, gave poor guidance to their populations. But I don't think it's true to say that with different leaders, these countries would have done significantly better. If Joe Biden had magically been president a year early, I don't think the US would have done much better, because the things that caused excess mortality last year weren't presidential decisions. They were utter failure of CDC to provide testing. That definitely wasn't Trump's fault. Scott Gottlieb's book makes that very clear. It's just been published recently. We utterly failed to use technology for contact tracing, which the Koreans did very well. We didn't really quarantine anybody seriously. There was no enforcement of quarantine. And we exposed the elderly to the virus as quickly as possible in elderly care homes. And these things had very little to do with presidential incompetence. So I think leadership is of somewhat marginal importance in a crisis like this, because what you really need is your public health bureaucracy to get it right. And very few Western public health bureaucracies got it right. Could the president have given better leadership? Yes. His correct strategy, however, was to learn from Barack Obama's playbook with the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic killed as many people on Obama's watch as COVID did on Trump's watch. And it was worse in a sense because it only happened in the US, and each year it killed more people than the year before, over 8 years. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever seriously blamed Obama for the opioid epidemic. Trump's mistake was to put himself front and center of the response, to claim that he had some unique insight into the pandemic, and to say, with every passing week, more and more foolish things, until even a significant portion of people who'd voted for him in 2016 realized that he'd blown it, which was why he lost the election. The correct strategy was actually to make Mike Pence the pandemic czar and get the hell out of the way. That's what my advice to Trump would have been. In fact, it was in February of last year. So the mistake was to try to lead. But actually, leadership in a pandemic is almost a contradiction in terms. What you really need is your public health bureaucracy not to fuck it up. And they really, really fucked it up. And that was then all blamed on Trump.
Yes.
You know, Jim Fallows writes a piece in The Atlantic that says, well, being the president's like flying a light aircraft, it's pilot error. And I read that piece and I thought, does he really, after all the years he spent writing, think that being president is like flying a light aircraft? I mean, It's really nothing like flying a light aircraft. Being president is you sit on top of a vast bureaucracy with how many different agencies? 60, 70, we've all lost count. And you're surrounded by advisors, at least a quarter of whom are saying, this is a disaster, we have to close the borders. And the others are saying, no, we have to keep the economy going. That's what you're running on in November. So being a president in a pandemic is a very unenviable position because you actually can't really determine whether your public health bureaucracy will get it right or not.